Would George beat Max if they placed them alongside each other in the Mercedes next year? Has Max checked out of the championship? Alpine are hiring Bottas, and is Lando now back in the championship, or will he bottle it again? All this and more answered in this week's episode of your biggest F1 questions, starting, well, now. Hello everybody and welcome back to your biggest F1 questions, the weekly show where we discuss the biggest questions from you, the F1 fans around the world who text me, tweet me or punch me in the face in the street. So let's get into the first question straight from the Dino's mouth. Is Lando back now as the favourite for the championship? I would say definitely not, to be honest with you. I mean, is he back? Yes, I think he's within a chance once again of the championship. Look, I know a lot of people think that he's just not championship material, and I think that that's just, an unfair appraisal, a biased appraisal, because he has a lot of things going for him that other world champions had as well. I don't like to bash on Jenson Button too much, but like Jenson Button, if Lando was in that same situation Jenson was in, Lando wins that championship as well. And Jenson Button went on after that, and before that even, to prove he's an incredibly talented racer. But would I put Jenson Button up there with a Max Verstappen, a Vettel, a Lewis? No, simply I just wouldn't. But Jenson was a very, very quick driver. And Lando has that too. Lando is incredibly quick. But Jenson also struggled under some deep pressures in 2009, mainly around tyres, but there was, some other points as well. Now, I'm not saying that Jenson bottled as much as Lando or anything like that. I'm not digging at Lando. My point is, I would say that if you go back, and I remember watching at the time, if you told me that Jenson Button would be the 2009 world champion, I wouldn't have believed you. The whole point of that little rant is to say that, look, Lando has most things a world champion needs. He is very good at racecraft, believe it or not. You can look at Austria this weekend. He is very good at pace. I mean, his raw speed is unbelievable. And I'm going to say something that's going to annoy people here. In terms of just raw pace, Lando is every bit as fast as Max Verstappen, as a Lewis Hamilton, as a Charles Leclerc. He is every bit as quick. He has the raw pace. He has the racecraft. The problem is he just isn't very good when it comes to dealing with pressure, when it comes to emotion. And this is the problem with the whole thing of like championship worthy, because championship worthiness swings wildly depending on who is in the competitive cars around you. Because if Oscar wasn't in the other car right now, if Daniel Ricciardo had stuck around in the form that he was in, Lando would be leading this championship by a mile right now. Lando would be beating Max Verstappen right now because the car is better. So it all comes down to who your competitors are. So I think that championship worthy thing is a bit not, it doesn't really make sense. And I know we like to throw it around, but it doesn't really add up. So I don't know why I answered that. Like, is Lando championship worthy? But I just wanted to get that out of the way. Now, as for, is Lando back as the favorite like he was essentially at the start of the year, because we knew what the pace would be like and so on of the car. And we knew it would be somewhat of a struggle for Red Bull unless they really came back at Imola, which looked less and less likely. But the problem now that Lando has is Lando has these problems under pressure and Oscar doesn't. And Lando used to be able to kind of make up for that against Oscar because he was just much faster than Oscar in general. Now, by much faster, I mean a tenth or two, but it was consistently, he was always a tenth or two faster. And in fact, over this season, if we just look at the raw pace figures throughout the races and throughout all of the sessions, Lando is technically still the quicker driver by a tiny margin. Again, roughly a tenth or so. But Lando is once again throwing away the championship by losing it under pressure because he's a tenth quicker basically everywhere except in the Q3 lap where it's most important. And this year, passing is so difficult, the dirty air is so bad that is the most important point, and that's where Oscar stays at his pace and Lando falters. And then on top of that, Lando is then under so much pressure in the car that things like Canada happened. So the problem I have is that I do think that this new front wing and this new suspension change that's come has fixed relatively the issues for Lando. Now, we have a very small window to see that in. We have Canada before the front wing and we have Austria with the front wing. Austria really did show that it gave Lando the comfort. We'll need to see it over more tracks, but I do think it has made a difference. And the reason I think it's made a difference is because we don't get much information out of Austria, given its straights and high-speed corners, essentially. So it doesn't give us a huge range. The fact that he was able to kind of break late when fighting Piastri, that tells me this has fixed his core issue, because the core issue for Lando this year has been an absolute lack of confidence in the braking and the front end. He has been unsure whether the brakes would allow him to slow down and get the car rotated to get in through the corners. And it seems like that's fixed, because Oscar, who's been incredibly comfortable with it and who we know is willing to make a lunge, wasn't able to really outbrake Lando without absolutely just throwing the car at him. So I think it has fixed those issues. But my problem with Lando being the favourite is I just think that we'll have a few races now where Lando gets his groove back. And then I think as soon as, if he does, as soon as he gets into the lead of the championship again and all the conversation becomes, so are you the favourite for the title now? Lando will just start making those mistakes again constantly that we've seen. So yeah, I don't think he's the favourite. And I think unless he starts beating Oscar like every qualifying session to the point where Oscar just can't win races because, it means that he's basically relying on Lando to make a mistake. Unless Lando starts dominating in that way, which I just don't see happening like he did last year, like Lando dominated Oscar last year. I just don't see it. I really don't, unfortunately. And I like Lando, John. I just don't see it. I don't see it happening next year. Okay. Thoughts on Verstappen-Horner exit plan? Yeah, so this is the recent news that while we know Verstappen has been in talks with Mercedes, as much as Toto has confirmed it, we don't know the extent of those. Because obviously all drivers of that caliber have talks with their teams. Most drivers have talks with their teams anyway. Their management teams do. We do know that there's been some kind of quote unquote advanced talks, and he's really considering options given where Red Bull is. However, this is based on the news that we heard that essentially Verstappen has said that his intention or his first choice is to stay at Red Bull and not trigger the exit clause, which would come on July 30th. But for that to happen, he would have some requirements. So the exit clause basically is it's either third or fifth in the championship or third or fourth. I think he has to be third or higher is what I'm hearing lately. I did hear third, basically, it's basically third or lower. But yeah, anyway, so he's either on that exit clause or he's very close to it because George is only 9 points away from him. The irony of if George gets replaced because he beats Verstappen this season and triggers Verstappen's exit clause is not lost on me, but that's for a different question. The main thing here though is that he has said his first choice is to stay at Red Bull. However, he would have a requirement that, he would like to stay at Red Bull if a few things are met. Now, we don't know what all of those are, but what we have heard is that one of them is that Horner either leaves or gives up a lot of his control. Now, I'm not going to go into a long rant about, what I feel about Horner leaving, just because, look, I've talked about it so much in the past. Horner as a person, I think, leaves a lot to be desired, but as a team principal, he's been instrumental in the success of that team. And as I've said before, frankly, if you remove him, it's game over for that team, as far as I'm concerned, at least in the foreseeable future. So I think this is another situation where it's probably going to go down a route of if Verstappen does leave the team, it's because Horner won't give up control. But I do think that this is a situation of the board and Jos Verstappen basically trying to put pressure on Horner and on the board to step down. The other thing it could be is it could simply be a tactic to basically make like an unreasonable request where, Horner's just not going to go for it, and then Verstappen's family and clan and whatnot and then Verstappen's management team and father can just be like, well, look, we offered a reason to stay, but he wouldn't take it. I think, honestly, if that is the requirement to stay, that Horner goes, like, part of me kind of hopes it happens because it'll be funny, because lately a lot of Verstappen fans have been very cult LH-esque in their assessment of things going on, and seem to think that, the Verstappens are building the team, and that, basically if Horner left, then Verstappen could just the Verstappens could run the team and everything would be fine. Frankly, the fact is, if Horner goes, it's going to be run by the board. I've talked about this at length before, but essentially they're not going to win again, if they ever do, for at least half a decade, if not longer. Because this is just the cycle of F1. It's been this way through history all the time. And as long as the board is running it, which they will be no matter who takes over, because they'll be at the behest of the board, the team will fall apart. So if Verstappen does decide to stay and it's without Horner, then I think it's kind of a moot point, because at the end of the day, if that happens, they're going to have a really difficult 2026. They're going to start cycling through team principals more than likely. Because they're going to put someone in, there's going to be disagreements, it's going to go back and forth. And by 2027, it's going to be a situation of, we have to replace the team principal again, and the car is really shit, and the team is really shit, and we've got loads to fix. And Verstappen goes, right, I'm not sticking around, I'm out of here anyway. And we're back to square one. So realistically, my thought on it is, if it's about Red Bull's future success, then take Horner over Verstappen. Because I think, look, Verstappen's going probably away from Red Bull in the next 2-3 seasons anyway, even if they were successful. He's talked about retiring, or at least taking some time off. Either way, he's not going to be there forever. So you're better off keeping Horner and working on, getting a number 2 in who can actually build up slowly for when Horner does go. If you're a Verstappen fan who's thinking purely about Verstappen's success, then if it's stay at Red Bull without Horner, then you might as well ask Verstappen to leave, because staying at Red Bull without Horner is staying at Red Bull unsuccessfully anyway. So I don't know. It's kind of either stay and try and hold things together as they are and actually all get on board and rebuild together, or stay and pull it apart. It doesn't make sense to me. Which is why I assume it's Jos Verstappen's idea and not Max's, because Max seems sensible and Jos doesn't, never has. Tommy says, anything interesting in the penalty guidelines? Can you explain them? Yeah. So Mohammed bin Sulayem did something actually good for a change. Quelle surprise. I reckon it was just to curry some favour. And it's around election year, all these things and so on. So I would imagine it's just to do with that and nothing more. But yeah, so they did release the menu of guidelines that the stewards have, which according to George Russell, who would know as the head of the GDPA, or GPDA, is it? Grand Prix Drivers, GPDA. It's been around for years now. I'm not sure which year exactly, but it's been around for years apparently. But essentially, this is a basically cheat sheet of what penalties to give. And finally, they've released it publicly. They still, interesting, haven't released the overtaking guidelines, which we've discussed at length on this channel and on the Blatantly Biased Racing podcast, which you should subscribe to. But that's beside the point. Yeah, so this is basically a group of guidelines, which I'll put in the link in the description below for anyone interested. But you've probably already seen them. But it's essentially some guidelines for the stewards to read in the case of any given incident. And I think it clears up a lot of the confusion that people have. And I think the key for this is, while everyone will still absolutely argue bias when something happens to Verstappen or happens to Hamilton, for example, as well as a group of other drivers. It does explain what the stewards are actually selecting and why certain things have happened. So one of the key takeaways, the interesting point for me was we knew that this year there was kind of a baseline 10-second penalty to be given for more or less everything. Like if they're giving a penalty, 10 second is the minimum, as opposed to 5 from last year. What we have seen is we've seen a lot of people calling out, well, why is there bias? Because like the 10-second penalty was pretty much unanimous last year as well, I think, for most of the season. It's not all of it. Maybe it came in last year. Sorry, I'm getting old. And we saw a lot of people complaining when, say, Norris would get a 5-second penalty or Max would get a 5-second penalty instead of a 10. So it turns out that, first of all, in these guidelines, it specifically says like it should be 5 seconds if there's mitigating circumstances. So essentially, if there is some mitigating circumstances, then it's a 5-second penalty straight away, according to the guidelines. So it's not bias as much as, I guess the argument would be like, what are those mitigating circumstances confined to? I'm pretty sure it doesn't actually define like mitigating circumstances. But no, it doesn't, as far as I know. I think it says no, there is no. So the judgment of mitigating circumstances is just up to the stewards themselves. So that's one interesting thing, I think, that kind of shows us like why we've seen things go from a 10-second to a 5-second penalty. So that's been interesting. We do know that, there's been a good few cases now where we've seen a driver get 3 penalty points for one thing. And then in a different situation, someone gets a penalty point for the same thing. Those are up to the steward's discretion as well. Essentially, there is a maximum, I believe it is. There's actually wording here, which I can read. I've got it here in front of me. So, the penalty points that are on the thing. So, for example, like causing a collision, it says 3 penalty points. This denotes the maximum number of penalty points depending upon the severity of the infringement. And yeah, there's a few things like that. For example, there's certain penalty points that have been given out, but it's very, very clear about, what should be given. I think one other thing that it has also pointed out to me that I found interesting is in the past, it has been specifically talked about that consequences shouldn't be taken into account. That was actually in the regulations before, so that the penalty should be based on the incident as opposed to the consequences of that incident. This menu shows us that that is no longer the case. The sporting regulations I've checked no longer say that, as far as I can find. Maybe someone correct me in the comments if I'm wrong there. But essentially, there is wording here, for example, on causing a collision. No, sorry, it's a different one. Let me just pull this up here. Causing a collision with no immediate or obvious sporting consequence will be a reprimand, a 5-second penalty, 10-second penalty, or grid pace penalty if they refuse to take it. So causing a collision without consequences is a maximum of a 10-second penalty, normally a 5. So that's why we saw that. For example, in Austria, we didn't see a 10-second penalty because mitigating circumstances, basically, and they were able to go with the lowest option other than reprimand. So that was leniency for Tsunoda and Colapinto, for example. But that just brings into point that, without consequences, immediate consequences, basically, and obvious consequences. So the fact that Oscar didn't immediately like crash or lose places is why you would give a 5 seconds. Now, it is interesting that it's very specific on immediate, which means like it has to be a consequence in that moment. So you can't give a 10-second penalty because, 3 laps later the race ends and Oscar loses the race. It has to be an immediate consequence. So that makes sense. And the last thing that I found interesting in this is something that we saw in Spain, sorry. So we saw the 10-second stop-go penalties for Max, was it? And also for George in, I want to say, was it Imola? Or no, it was Monaco. So essentially, we can see now that, there's been 10-second penalties and so on, and they have to, they can give more. So all of the penalties are essentially like 5 seconds as a minimum up to the maximum of a drive through is the way it's worded. But basically, if you cause a collision with apparent deliberate or reckless intent, it's a stop and go penalty, or any time penalty exceeding 30 seconds, which I think Max was given the 10-second penalty, right? Yeah. So he's with no immediate obvious sporting collision. I can't remember, but that's a distinction. And it's the same for purposely going off track and getting an advantage. So basically, when George went off and intentionally just said, I'm not giving it back, that's why they were able to give something further than a 10-second penalty. So, I think this is interesting. I think you should read it if you haven't already. But I think those guidelines will become more and more interesting as time goes on and we see decisions made in races, because now we know what the stewards are looking at. So you basically are down to a case of like, well, do I agree with the inference that this was reckless or intentional, or do I agree with the mitigating circumstances? However, if those mitigating circumstances exist, regardless of whether you agree with them or not, at least we now have a better idea of whether, it's a correct decision or not, So yeah, I think it's good. Matthew says, who will Bottas replace at Alpine? Dear God, I hope it's Gasly. As you guys know, I'm a Colapinto fan. It's not looking good. I will say, though, I think, it's a pragmatic decision to hire Bottas for a few reasons, not least of which the fact that they're changing to the Mercedes power unit next year. So I think having a Mercedes driver in there who is a Grand Prix winner in the Mercedes, has been tied to the Mercedes, was trained and brought in by Toto himself, all of that makes sense. And I also think that given his years of experience in top tier machinery, as well as the last couple of years in a Sauber, I think they do need someone who has that kind of experience to lead them in the right direction and give them a good idea of where they'd be. Because look, I think Gasly is a good driver, but I don't think Gasly is a great driver. And from everything I've heard, his technical feedback isn't brilliant. And then Franco is more so a rookie. So, I mean, what can he give you? Now, I'm biased here. If I was going there in that situation, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I'd replace Gasly. I mean, I just feel at a team like that, especially going into 2026, you want a driver who has serious potential in terms of racecraft and pace, a young driver who's capable of kind of being the future of the team if he's given time, looked after and so on. I think that's Colapinto. And we kind of know the upper limit of Gasly, and Gasly comes with experience and pace, and he's a safe pair of hands. And if you bring Gasly, or if you bring Bottas in, he gives you that and more. So it seems kind of pointless to me to have a Bottas and Gasly lineup. However, I know I'm massively biased there, and you could also make the other side of that argument, which is if you're rebuilding, you just want two capable pair of hands who are going to show you what the car is actually capable of on both sides of the garage. So I think, yes, the pragmatic approach in the short term is Gasly and Bottas. However, I do think that Colapinto has massive upside. And I think in a less pressured situation where he's given time to grow, we would see the Colapinto of last year at Williams. And I think that Colapinto beats Gasly all day long if you get him built up. But it's just one Irishman's opinion. All right, guys. So on to quick fire questions. And I think it's going to be a shorter episode than normal, which is good for the editing part of this. Oh, maybe not. This is a quick fire one from Trev. Who would win at Merck in George versus Max in 2026? So who would win at Merck between George and Max for 2026, Trev? This question, this is lawyer speak, isn't it? It's very, very specific. So if we were just talking who would win at Merck between George and Max, and there was no time period on it, my answer would probably be Max in the long term. However, if we're talking about next year, just 2026, which we are, I think George beats Max. And I'll tell you why. Frankly, there's not a lot between George and Max in terms of pace. Max has been more battle hardened, 100%. So I think Max is much more willing to push things to the limits. However, George has been probably the best driver of the season so far. Argue that one in the comments, but I absolutely think he has been. And I think George, especially in the last couple of races, I know Austria, the car wasn't there, whatever. In the last few races, it seems like George is giving it everything and Max is kind of checking out a little bit, which is very unusual. It's the first time I've ever been in a situation where Max hasn't given it his all every weekend, but he seems to have checked out a little bit. But anyway, George is the best driver of the season. Now, I think that when it comes to the two of them, there's very little between them. When we're on the absolute upper limits of performance, not in terms of pace. I actually think George is very, very close to Max in terms of pace. And I think that would swing back and forth because they're both very, very good qualifiers, like extremely good qualifiers. And they're both really good in race pace and management. They're both very good at racecraft. A lot of people will point out 2 races from George and go, well, he bottles under pressure, and forget about all the times that George has made absolutely incredible lap 1 overtakes, starts, overtakes in general, and they'll just go, oh, well, what about Australia and Singapore? Bottled it both times. And you're like, what about all the times Max has collided with other drivers? Just these are pointless arguments. It doesn't take away from how brilliant Max is. So you don't, because he's had 100 other races where he's been absolutely spectacular, and George is similar to that. So, yeah, you can have that argument. It's a daft one. It's fucking idiotic, but, who am I to judge? But I'm judging you. So, yeah, I think there's very little between them. I think Max is the slightly better driver in a variety of forms. And I think when it comes to winning a title, Max would be able to kind of put more pressure on George than George would be able to put on Max. So I think in terms of overall package, Max is better. However, for 2026, you're talking a situation where Max will be going into a car that hasn't been developed to Max's limits. It is a car that the setup and the changes to it would have mapped more and more towards George as the incumbent. And George is frankly just on top of the car. So whatever the car can give, George can get it out of it. So Max is not going to be able to do that straight away. He's an epic racing driver. He's not a god. He's going to sit in that car. He's going to have to adapt. That's going to take some races. He's going to have to adapt to the engine. And while I think he'll do that in 6 or 7 races and adapt, he's not going to be at his absolute best until at least half a season goes by. So I think in that situation, George wins. Plus, George knows all the team members. After a year or so, I could see the Verstappen camp pulling engineers and mechanics over to his side and kind of, reorganizing things the way he wants. But for the very first season, as per the question, George, all day long. And if you disagree, let me know why in the comments. But I think just the pragmatic answer. John says, will McLaren still be strong in 2026? Short answer, yes. Long answer, coming up. Yeah, I think I think they will be, and the reason I think they will be is, look, it's coming from just a massive variety of sources now that the Mercedes engine is the best. Now, a lot of that happens in isolation, so it's always guesswork, right? And the other thing is, a lot of it is down to which teams are most optimistic, most pessimistic, and you're also getting a lot of this information in leaks from the teams of drivers and the teams of engineers who are looking to go to different teams. And they're getting kind of a loose insight into where Mercedes is, where Red Bull is, where Honda is, as a bargaining chip to be like, look, we're probably going to be the best engine next year. Or, this is where our engine's looking at. And then they can kind of compare the figures that they've gotten. So it's going to be a pinch of salt always. But it does seem, with the confidence and what everyone's thinking, Mercedes is going to be the strongest next year. How much further ahead of the other two who are behind it, surprisingly Audi and of course Honda, and how far they are ahead of Ferrari and Red Bull powertrains, that's the real question. Because, being the best engine could mean they have a 3 horsepower advantage and it means nothing. It could be 50 horsepower and it means everything. So we don't know that yet. But if it is a case that Mercedes does have the most powerful engine, then McLaren will have that most powerful engine. And unlike 2014 and, the years before that, McLaren are, under the regulations, required to get the exact same engine that Mercedes gets, right? In terms of power mappings, in terms of just the engine, in terms of the upgrades. If HPP come up with an upgrade and it's going to come in for Silverstone, for example, McLaren have access to that upgrade for the same race as Mercedes, which kind of helps to narrow that gap between customer and works team. Now, a works team will always have the advantage because they can develop the engine, in line with their chassis. So how they build the philosophy of their chassis and the packaging of their chassis, they can build the engine to work towards that. That's the advantage of being a works team. However, the power difference will be very little. And the thing that makes me think that McLaren could still be fighting for a title, even if the Mercedes is the most powerful next year, is that McLaren now, by far and away, have the best aerodynamics team by far. I think Newey will have the best aero team maybe in the next year or two, but he's going to have to mold that. That's going to take some time. And while Newey, I think, will make that team a lot more competitive next year, it is not a quick turnaround. We've seen this in the past. We've seen Newey move in the past. And Newey himself doesn't, as brilliant as Newey is, and as much respect as I have for him, and even Newey will admit this, Newey alone does not give you everything. What Newey does is he can come in, spot the decisions, the line to go down, he can spot the people, he can spot the errors, and he can form that team together and set the direction perfectly and point out the errors. But he's still going to have to mold everything around, right? So I think for the next 2 seasons, probably until 2027, 2028, at least, I would say that McLaren will have the best team. The question then comes to could Newey spot something in the regulations that McLaren miss? How close will they be, basically? But yeah, I think McLaren will probably have the best aero team, and Mercedes will probably, while they'll do well on the engine, by all indications, they're still struggling on the aero side. So I would not be at all surprised next year if Mercedes is the most powerful engine and McLaren is still beating them. So in Rob Marshall, we trust. Rob Marshall is the next, he's the next, that literally old question. How did I not know that? Rob Marshall is the next Newey as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, I've said that. Amy says, how do I subscribe? Oh, thanks so much for asking, Amy. Just hit that subscribe button below. It's open to everyone and it's absolutely free. Oh, and she also asks, will Hamilton be on the podium at Silverstone? Oh, I don't know. I don't want to bet against Hamilton being on the podium at Silverstone, but the problem is, if Hamilton's on the podium at Silverstone, it's because Leclerc has won the race. Yeah, I don't know. Ferrari's not bringing any upgrades until Spa now. They've delayed their suspension upgrade and a few other upgrades. So I don't see it, Amy, to be honest with you. I think when it comes to this track, you've got high-speed corners, you've got long turns, and you've got, the long straights as well, which is McLaren and Red Bull territory. The two McLarens are probably going to be 1-2 here. And I think it's probably a situation where I'd be surprised if they even beat Mercedes at Silverstone, to be honest, depending on the weather. But they'd have to beat at least Oscar, Lando, and Max to get there. He might be. I mean, he is spectacular around here and he always beats the odds around Silverstone. So it's daft to bet against him at this particular track. But I mean, we bet against him. I mean, like, it would have been daft to bet against him in Canada as well. And I mean, that didn't really work out. So I'm going to say no, personally. Yeah. Shane says, why did McLaren give Norris pit preference at Austria? Yeah, he did. They didn't. Is the answer to that. I've seen a good few people talking about this, like, oh, Lando only won because they gave him the undercut, like, preferentially or whatever. It's just not the case. The simple fact is, McLaren have set up a really interesting situation for all of us. That if it is the case that Max and Red Bull aren't going to get any better and that this is going to be a 2-horse race in that one team, McLaren have set up a situation where essentially both sides of the garage are working against each other. So Oscar has his team and his engineer and his mechanics, and then Lando has his. They both get the same like strategy data and everything, and the pit wall dives in when they need to, but essentially both sides are working against each other. And it's not like Norris got pit preference. He was just ahead in the race. And simple as they just knew that, they couldn't actually call Oscar in first, because if they did so, they'd have to do it really early. And if they tried to do it, like, Lando could just be told to box and then Oscar would have to cancel to get the double stack. So they just didn't have the option because they didn't have the track position. So that was that. And frankly, as soon as Oscar got that flat spot, Will Joseph and his side of the garage made the exact right call of just, all right, let's come in now straight away, because they knew that Oscar was going to have to call to come into box because Oscar was complaining about it on the radio. So the moment he said I had a flat spot, Will Joseph come on the radio and said, come in and box, which was the pragmatic solution, because, you're basically forcing him to do another lap when he's got a tire that's got a flat spot and he's struggling. So yeah, he didn't get pit preference. He just had track position and therefore could make the call first. And at the end of the day, like, if Oscar had said box, like, or if Oscar had said I want to come in, they had said box, they would have had to do it really, really late, because otherwise Will Joseph could have just said box, and then they would have to stay out for another lap. So it's not preferential treatment. It's just what happens when you're ahead. You can make those calls first, but you're also ahead, so you have to make those calls. Jack says, has Max given up on the title? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't want to count Max out ever, because it's daft to do, but I do think he has given up on the title, mainly because they have, I think, a couple more upgrades in the pipeline, but nothing major. And it looks like now that the McLaren have kind of set up the car perfectly, where they've got two different versions, one that Oscar loves where he can perform brilliantly in, and one that Lando loves that he can perform brilliantly in. I think it'll be a bit silly of Max to give up straight away, because you could end up still with 13 races to go in a Raikkonen situation, where these two guys start really taking points off each other and the guy behind catches up. But he just seems checked out. I guess we'll see in the next couple of races. Maybe he'll come back. But yeah, I think he's given up on the title, and I don't really blame him, because, I mean, he's in the position now where Lando was last year, and he doesn't have a car that's as competitive. To be honest, the difference now between the Red Bull and the McLaren is bigger than it was between the Red Bull and the McLaren last year. And it was very unlikely that Lando was going to pull that back. Now, Max could maybe do it, but yeah, I think it's a stretch. So personally, I don't think it's going to happen. Oh, last one. Let's see. Killian asks, predictions for Great Britain for Silverstone. Yeah, I'll do this pretty quick. I do think that the Red Bull will be strong around this particular track. I think it'll be really strong around this particular track. However, I also think that the McLaren's going to be up there, and yeah, so just because my brain is saying it's going to be Oscar, Lando, Max, because I think the McLaren's going to be particularly strong around here. But to make things interesting, and because I think this could happen, I'm going to say Max, Oscar, Lando. Yeah. Thanks for all the questions, guys. That's the end of it. And I appreciate it as always. Please leave more questions for next week in the comments. And I'll see you for another episode next Wednesday. Don't forget to check out Storytime this Saturday, which by popular demand will be Lamborghini. And thanks to someone who commented, next week will be the Porsche episode. And I was supposed to have the Vettel episode out this week, but of Car Heroes, the new series. However, that will be out next week instead. Just things have been crazy. So thank you so much. Please do check those out. I would really appreciate it. And I'll see you next week for another one.